Healing in Luke. About 10 years ago, a biblical scholar by the name of Frederick Gaiser wrote a book called Healing in the Bible. In a world where daily statistics about pandemic, illness and death are now taken for granted, perhaps it is timely to reflect on biblical stories of healing and see what they have for us today. It has been noticeable during the pandemic that some political leaders have mentioned the importance to them of attending faith gatherings. When we hear them, the assumptions might be around the value of being part of a community, socialising, encouraging, supporting one another. There's also implied issues of ideology and corporate expressions of faith and belief. We hear about personal choices, giving us an insight to the lives and lifestyles of civic leaders who portray themselves as just as human as you and me. When Gaiser launched his book, Walter Brueggemann wrote, "Healing has almost dropped out of the so-called healthcare debate, drowned out by political and economic issues and loud competing ideologies." Gaiser pointed out that healing involves more than science. He didn't want to replace modern scientific medicine with faith healing, but did stress that scientific medicine addresses just one dimension of a mystery of healing and wholeness that asks for other perspectives. These different dimensions have theological implications, and so we recollect the words from Exodus 15:26, "I am the Lord who heals you." Here the Israelites are reminded to follow the commandments and avoid the diseases of Egypt. It becomes clear that worldly systems based on greed and injustice lead to an unwellness in communities and societies. As social geographers might put it, we can see community pathologies, times when people act as a mob or undermine social cohesion and wholeness. Competition for toilet paper or rapid antigen tests springs to mind. When are we driven to focus on personal survival of the fittest, and when are we seeking the common good? I'm reminded of a quote by Desmond Tutu. "Do your little bit of good wherever you are. It's those little bits of good put together that overwhelm the world." The wisdom literature in the Bible keeps in front of us the plot line that deeds have consequences. Our theology, how we think about God, shapes how we contribute to society and the common good. Our understanding of God as a loving creator of holy community should have a visible impact on our participation in the community around us. The Psalms invite us to lament and confess the need for the healing of a world experiencing pain and sorrow. The Gospels encourage us to speak hope into a hurting world. This word of hope comes in different ways in different stories of healing. Gaiser's philosophy is that good theology contributes to good health and bad theology can lead to death. One's theology can make one resigned or make one expectant. He claims this is a non-negotiable assumption of the biblical tradition. When we read and hear the gospel stories of healings, we're invited to consider more than physical cures or physical miracles. We're invited to consider healing as something bigger. There are various definitions of the term healing. It's not just the absence of illness, but the process of being made well and whole. There is a sense of restoration. Jeremiah 30 verse 17 says, "But I will restore you to health and heal your wounds, declares the Lord." Luke's Gospel is an important one for our thinking about healing. Luke was a physician. He was concerned about physical ailments and how people were functioning. What he describes in Jesus is the life of a teacher-healer. For Luke, Jesus is a holy man, a spirit-filled prophet who vanquishes unclean spirits and a variety of illnesses and restores people into their proper places in community. He uses the healing moment to teach about spiritual well-being. Bruce Molina and Richard Rawburn write in their commentary on the Synoptic Gospels, "In our contemporary world, we tend to view disease as a physical malfunction that can be remedied, assuming a cause and cure are known by proper biomedical treatment. We focus on restoring a sick person's ability to function, to do. Yet often overlooked is the fact that health and sickness are always culturally defined, and that in the ancient Mediterranean, one's state of being was more important than one's ability to act or function. The healers of the ancient world focused on restoring a person to a valued state of being rather than an ability to function." This is sometimes described by anthropologists as the difference between disease and illness. Disease is related to the physical, and illness is largely experienced as social. Often a disease has the impact of being experienced as an illness. For example, when we have a cold or flu symptoms, or register a positive COVID test, even when we're not experiencing symptoms, we need to isolate from social contact. Even if we think we're okay and have negative results, we're still suffering from the illness of having to keep socially distant. We still feel captive to the impacts of COVID and isolation. We lament, when will we experience full healing and wholeness? The illness is not cured by gathering in a room and singing together. All the best research shows that congregations who gather indoors and sing are likely to spread disease, unintentionally and unknowingly. However, we should be working towards healing illness. People in our society, including members of our congregation, are struggling with the illnesses associated with loneliness, stress, uncertainty, and anxiety. Among us are people who are depressed and mentally fatigued, and others who are exhausted from hypervigilance and carrying responsibilities for others. Before the pandemic, we talked about loneliness being one of the greatest crises of our times. Now the combination of loneliness and the need to actively isolate and distance means illness is everywhere. What I'm even more concerned about is those people who are unable to join us online for worship. We try to keep in touch with phone calls and dropping in resources, and many of you have responded to the packages we've been putting together with reflective booklets and items for focusing on the season. We've had lots of notes and calls from people who receive these who are not online. For them, in their isolation, it has been a key sign of care and a lifeline to keep us even tenuously connected. So if you know of people who are limiting their contact with others, who might benefit from receiving our Lent Easter pack, please let us know. If you don't know anyone in particular but would like to support this ministry, we do need to cover the costs, so your donation or your willingness to do some deliveries in the last week of February would be very welcome. A couple of weeks ago, I spoke about the importance of people being in small groups for encouragement and for connection. And now I'm harping on small groups again. The term koinonia is from the Greek, and it refers to concepts such as fellowship, joint participation, sharing in everything and anything, a gift jointly contributed, a collection, a contribution. It identifies the state of fellowship and unity that should exist within the Christian Church, the body of Christ. Many of us grew up in the church thinking of koinonia as small groups or fellowship groups. The term is used 43 times in the New Testament. It carries more than the idea of friendship. It implies common sacrifice and generous shared spirit. It describes common purpose and commitment. I had occasion during the week to talk with half a dozen different members of our congregation about ministry values in the Uniting Church. For a so-called short week, there were quite a few pastoral conversations, and in each conversation I ended up explaining something that I think is a Uniting Church characteristic. This is not a church where the main goal is worship attendance. We don't measure our effectiveness as a church by how many people attend worship. Worship allows our relationship to go deeper with God and nourishes us for the work God has for us to do. Worship binds us together as a holy community of care and concern. So worship is important, but it is not the measure of who we are. Rather, this is a congregation and this is a church where we hope that every person is welcomed into the kind of relationship where we can be spiritual and practical family to one another. We seek to care for one another, and we invite each and every one of you to become carers of others. The measure of a Uniting Church congregation is how we care for each other and the world we live in. Worship allows us to gain nourishment from focusing on God and being encouraged and inspired by God. And it gives us an opportunity to be formed more deeply as the people of God, God's mission team on earth. Out of our experience of worship and our sacrifice of praise, we should be encouraged to live out our discipleship in the world for the sake of the world's restoration. We should be encouraged to seek fullness and restoration for all. Our Zoom poll from a couple of weeks ago showed the following. When asked what might help and encourage you personally, many people said reading materials or small groups. About a quarter said the at-home packs, and 40% said online classes. When you were asked what kinds of small groups might you find helpful, there was a pretty even mix of choosing Bible study, friendship social groups, and special interest groups. About a quarter of you were keen to be part of a mission team, and a few households expressed the desire to meet as family groups. When asked how you might encourage others, half a dozen people said they were willing to host a small group, and more than that said they could be a support person. And more than 3/4 said they were willing to participate. As you can see, this doubled up. People gave multiple responses supporting several different answers. But the strongest preferences for methods of participation were for online groups. Quite a lot of people were also willing to meet at church, outside, or in a cafe or a club. Now, because there was such a mix of responses, there is no clear and obvious single way forward, but that's okay. We recognise that this is a community of diversity. Not everyone is expected to do everything. Not everyone is expected to do the same things as each other. What is important is that we have a range of offerings so that you have the opportunity to connect and that you take some of the opportunities presented to you to make that connection. So, do not try to do everything on offer. That's a sure way to burn out. Do try a couple of different kinds of groups over the next 6 months and see what works for you at this stage of life. Remember, we are at different ages and stages during our lifetimes. Different things will suit us. Don't be afraid to have a go, and don't be afraid to change. Here are some of the things that are coming up. We're looking at companion groups, Bible studies, Book group. We'll be continuing with the Monday night group, and we'll probably start looking at a Lenten study by Amy Jill Levine. There's the potential for a craft group. We're going to make some tile mosaics to decorate the courtyard area and maybe make some banners. There are the fellowships that gather for lunch in cafes and clubs, and we're hoping to start a music group, probably on Thursday nights, so that we can actually more confidently learn some of the new things that we've been starting to play with over the last year. All of these things, all of these groups are about healing and restoration and forming community. It's part of who we are as church and part of the characteristic that we are called upon to act with koinonia. So, may the peace of God be with each and every one of you. Amen.